She stepped onto the empty last train, and that was the last time anyone saw her breathing. The station was dead silent with the humming of fluorescent lights above and the cold air thick with the scent of metal and rain. She felt the vibration under her shoes as the train approached, crawling into the station like a steel serpent, its headlights glowing like tired eyes. The doors slid open with a sigh, and she stepped inside, clutching her worn-out bag close to her chest. Nadia was 24, working double shifts to pay rent and send something back home to her mother, who kept waiting for her calls every Sunday night. But tonight the call would never come. She moved to the far end of the carriage, sitting on the corner seat where she could rest her head against the window, the glass cold against her skin. The train smelled of rust and something she could not place, like an old wet cloth that had been forgotten somewhere. Dark, she looked at her reflection in the window, seeing her tired eyes, her hair falling around her face, and the empty seats behind her. The lights flickered above like the last heartbeat of something dying, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow sitting 3 seats behind her, but when she turned around there was nothing there. The train shuddered and moved forward into the tunnel, leaving the station lights behind, swallowing her in a tunnel of darkness and humming steel. Nadia pulled out her phone, checking the time, and saw it was almost midnight. Her mother would have called by now, asking if she had eaten, if she was safe, but the call never came, and Nadia felt the loneliness crawl under her skin. The tunnel outside was black, but sometimes she saw flashes of red lights passing by. Sometimes graffiti on the walls, half-seen messages of anger and love and loss. Sometimes she thought she heard whispers, but it could have been the tracks groaning under the weight of the train. The air felt thicker, now the kind that sits in your throat, making it hard to swallow. She tried to focus on her phone, scrolling through old messages, looking at photos of her and her mother in the kitchen, back home, laughing over burnt roti and overcooked tea, and for a moment she almost smiled. Then the train stopped. There was no station. There was no announcement. The train just stopped in the middle of the tunnel, and the lights went out, plunging her into darkness so complete it felt like the air itself had turned to stone. She could hear the faint hum of electricity somewhere deep in the metal veins of the train, but nothing else. No footsteps, no voices, no movement. She turned on her phone flashlight, pointing it toward the aisle, seeing the empty seats lined up like silent witnesses. The beam of light trembled as her hand shook, moving from seat to seat, each one empty, each one cold and waiting. She heard it, then a soft click like a door unlocking somewhere behind her in the dark. She turned the light, but saw nothing. She tried to call out, but her voice felt small, felt like it would break the silence in a way that would bring something closer. So she stayed quiet, straining to hear the sound again. There it was, closer this time, a soft click and a shuffle like shoes on the floor. She aimed the light at the back of the carriage, seeing the doors closed, seeing nothing else but the dark. She moved from her seat slowly, step by step, her shoes barely making a sound against the floor. Her breath was loud in her ears, her heart beat louder. She could see her reflection in the dark glass of the windows, the flashlight glaring back at her, but something else was there too. A shadow that did not belong to her, standing behind her in the reflection, tall and thin and still. She turned quickly, aiming the light, but there was nothing there, only empty seats and the cold metal poles. She felt the air change around her, felt it shift like something breathing beside her. She turned again, and the flashlight flickered once, twice, then came back on, and in that flicker she saw it, a face pale and watching her from the seat, 2 rose-back eyes, wide and empty, mouth open in a silent scream. She stumbled back, the light shaking wildly as she tried to keep it steady, but the seat was empty again, nothing there, but the shadow burned into her mind. Nadia tried to move back toward the door, but the train was still dead. The lights out, the doors locked. She pressed the emergency button, but nothing happened, only a small dead click. In the darkness, she tried again and again, pressing it until her thumb hurt, but nothing came, no voice, no sound, nothing but the darkness. Pressing closer, she heard footsteps, now slow and careful, moving toward her from the back of the carriage. Turned the light again, seeing the aisle empty, but the footsteps kept coming closer and closer, like something invisible moving in the dark. The smell hit her then stronger, now like rust and old water, and something sweet and rotting she covered. Her nose trying not to gag as she backed up against the door, pounding on it, with her fists screaming for help. But the tunnel outside was black and silent. Footsteps stopped right in front of her, and she felt something cold brush against her. "Hand," she screamed, dropping her phone, the flashlight, rolling across the floor, spinning until it pointed back at her, lighting up her own face, pale and terrified. She saw the reflection again in the glass behind her, the shadow standing there tall and thin, watching her, its hand reaching toward her shoulder. She felt the cold fingers on her skin pressing down as she tried to pull away. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. The lights flickered on for a moment, and she saw it fully for the first time. Standing behind her, a man, or what used to be a man, his skin gray and stretched over bones, eyes wide and empty, mouth open, but no sound coming out. She saw the uniform, the faded brown coat, the old subway badge pinned to the chest. The lights flickered again, and he was closer, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes looking into hers, as if trying to remember her face. She tried to scream, but her voice was gone, trapped in her throat as the lights flickered off again, plunging her back into darkness. She felt the cold seep into her skin, felt it crawl into her bones as the hand gripped her tighter. She could not move, could not breathe, could only hear the soft whisper close to her ear, calling her name over and over in a voice that sounded like her own. "Nadia, Nadia, Nadia." The lights came back for a moment, and she saw the other passengers standing in the aisle behind him, all pale, all watching her, eyes wide, mouths open, but silent. They were dressed in old clothes uniforms, bags still hanging from their shoulders, eyes empty, but staring at her as if waiting for something. She saw a little girl holding a teddy bear, a man in a business suit, a woman with a shopping bag, all standing in the aisle, watching her, waiting. Lights went out again, and she felt herself being pulled backward, away from the door, away from the hope of escape, into the darkness of the carriage. The whisper was in her ear again, calling her name softer, now almost gentle. "Nadia, come with us, come home." She tried to fight, tried to pull away, but the hands were everywhere, cold and strong, pulling her down, pulling her back into the darkness. Last thing she saw was her phone screen, still glowing on the floor, showing her own terrified face, and behind her, the pale face of the man in the brown coat, smiling as the darkness swallowed her, and the whisper turned into a single breath that sounded like her own voice calling for help. They found his flashlight still rolling on the tunnel floor, but Ahmed was gone, and the tunnel was silent, as if it had never held any footsteps at all. Ahmed was a security guard who had walked these tunnels for 7 years, knowing every curve, every crack in the concrete, every hum of the rails under his boots. But tonight the darkness felt alive, pressing against his skin, and whispering in a voice he could almost recognize. He had seen the last train leave with that girl, her eyes tired, her shoulders heavy with the weight of days that never ended, and he had seen her reflection in the glass of the last carriage. But what he had not seen was the pale face behind her, watching her with eyes that were nothing but emptiness and hunger. He had heard screams deep in the tunnel, and at first he thought it was the echo of the city above, the laughter and cries of the living leaking into the dark veins of the subway. But then he heard it again, louder and closer, a scream that was cut off, too quickly to be a joke, too raw to be anything but real. It was a scream that held the terror of someone who knew they were about to vanish forever, and Ahmed felt the chill run down his spine as he turned on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark like a thin blade of hope. But the hope was thin, and the darkness swallowed it quickly. He moved down the tunnel slowly, his boots scraping against the gravel, the sound echoing around him like the footsteps of someone else following him in the dark. He called out, but his voice was swallowed by the tunnel, absorbed into the concrete and steel, as if the walls were hungry for sound, for breath, for life. He felt the air grow colder around him, felt the way the darkness pressed closer and closer, as if it were breathing around him. And he could smell it now, the scent of old water, rust, and something else, something sweet and rotting, that made him cover his nose with the sleeve of his uniform. Ahmed found a phone on the ground, the screen cracked, but still blowing weakly. It was The girl's phone, and on the screen was a video frozen on the image of her terrified face, eyes wide, mouth open, and behind her in the reflection of the window was the pale face of a man, or what used to be a man, watching her with empty eyes. The video played without sound, but he could see the way her mouth moved, the way she screamed without a sound, and the way the shadow behind her moved closer until it was the only thing the camera could see before the screen went black. He felt something move in the darkness beside him, a whisper that brushed against his ear, a breath that was cold and smelled of the grave. He turned quickly, the flashlight beam swinging wildly across the tunnel walls, catching nothing but shadows that twisted and crawled away from the light. He called out again, but the darkness took his voice again and gave him nothing in return. He started to walk faster, the beam of his flashlight shaking as his hand trembled, the footsteps behind him matching his pace, always just behind him, always close enough for him to feel the breath on the back of his neck. He reached the maintenance door, a heavy steel door that led to the old service tunnels that had been closed for years, tunnels that no one used anymore because they were too narrow, too dark, too full of stories of workers who went in and never came out. He found the door slightly open, the lock broken, the darkness inside thicker than the darkness of the main tunnel, as if it was a darkness that had weight and hunger of its own. He should have turned back, he should have called for help, but something pulled him forward. A whisper that sounded like a girl calling for help, a voice that was almost familiar. He stepped inside the service tunnel, the flashlight beam barely cutting through the darkness. The walls were close. The air was heavy and wet, dripping with water that had leaked through the cracks above. And the smell was stronger here, the smell of rust and decay. And something else, something that smelled like fear. He moved forward slowly, the beam of the flashlight catching on old pipes, on graffiti scratched into the walls, words that were half erased. Help me. I am still here. They took me. I am not alone. And each word felt like a breath in the dark, a breath that was not his. He heard footsteps ahead of him, fast and light, like someone running, but there was no one there. He called out again, the voice echoing back to him, but twisted in the echo as if the tunnel was speaking back to him with his own voice, but not his own. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was heavier than the darkness pressing against him. He felt it again, the breath on his neck, the whisper in his ear, but when he turned there was nothing there. Nothing but the dark and the feeling that something was watching him, something that was waiting. He moved deeper into the tunnel, the air growing colder with each step, the darkness pressing closer and closer, until it felt like it was crawling inside his skin. He saw something ahead, a small light flickering on the ground, and when he reached it, he found another flashlight, the same model as his own, still on, still rolling slowly on the ground, as if someone had dropped it and walked away. But there were no footsteps, no sign of anyone, just the light rolling in the dark. He heard the scream again, closer now, clearer, now a scream that was cut off suddenly, followed by a whisper that called his name, Ahmed. Ahmed, come and help me, Ahmed. He felt his heart pound in his chest, felt the cold sweat on his skin as he moved forward, the flashlight beam shaking as it caught on something on the ground, something small and silver. It was a locket, the same locket the girl had been wearing in the video, the locket open with a small photo inside, a photo of her and her mother smiling in a world that was far away from this darkness. He felt the air move around him, felt the cold fingers brush against his arm, as the whisper came again, closer now, almost at his ear. Ahmed. Ahmed, help me please. He turned quickly, the light catching on a figure in the dark, a pale face, wide empty eyes, the mouth open, but no sound coming out. The uniform was old, stained with dirt and blood. The badge on the chest was cracked, but he could read the name of a worker who had gone missing years ago, the name that was still on the walls of the lost and the dead. The figure moved toward him slowly, the pale eyes locked on his, the mouth moving silently as the whisper filled the air around him. Ahmed, Ahmed, come with us. Come home. He stepped back, the flashlight shaking as the figure moved closer, the air growing colder, the smell of decay and rust filling his lungs. He tried to turn to run, but the tunnel was too narrow, the darkness too thick, and the whisper was inside his head. now calling him to stay, calling him to never leave. The last thing the camera saw was Ahmed standing in the tunnel, the flashlight rolling on the ground as the pale hands reached for him, pulling him into the darkness, pulling him into the place where the screams never stopped and the footsteps never faded. The tunnel was silent again, the air still and cold as the darkness closed around him, and the only sound left was the soft whisper of his name echoing in the dark. Ahmed, Ahmed, they say he waits at the far end of the platform, and if you see him, you will never make it home. Erin had heard this story from her roommate, who had heard it from an uncle who used to work in the subway tunnels at night. They all said the same thing: if you ever see the man in the brown coat with eyes like fog and skin like paper, turn around and leave, because if he sees you, it is already too late. Erin was 19, studying late for exams, and tired of being afraid of stories, so she took the last train home one rainy Thursday night, determined to prove to herself that the subway was just a subway, that ghosts were just stories, and that she was not a child anymore. The platform was empty, except for the flickering lights that buzzed overhead like angry insects. The tracks glistened with rainwater dripping from the cracks above. The cold air smelled of wet stone and iron. Held her books close to her chest as she stepped onto the train, the doors sliding shut behind her. With a heavy sigh, the carriage was empty, and for a moment she felt relieved, thinking she would have the ride home in peace, without noise, without people, without stories. But the relief was thin, and it left quickly as the train began to move and the lights overhead flickered once, twice before settling into a pale, sick glowering. Sat near the window, watching the tunnel walls slip by, covered in graffiti and darkness. She felt the hum of the tracks under her feet, felt the cold air leaking through the seams of the train. She glanced at her reflection in the window, her tired eyes staring back at her hair damp from the rain, shoulders slumped from carrying books and fear. But behind her reflection, she saw something that made her heart stop for a moment. A figure standing at the far end of the carriage, tall, thin, wearing a brown coat with a torn collar and eyes that were gray and empty like fog at dawn. She turned quickly, but the end of the carriage was empty, the seats lined up in silence, the air still as if nothing had moved, nothing had breathed. But she felt it now, a coldness that slipped around her shoulders like a wet cloth. The train rattled, and the lights flickered again, and in the reflection, she saw him again, closer now, one row closer, the brown coat hanging from his shoulders like a shroud, the eyes watching her without blinking, without seeing, and yet seeing everything. Erin stood up, clutching her books to her chest as she backed away toward the doors, trying to keep her eyes on the reflection, trying not to blink. The lights flickered again, and he was closer, 2 rows away, the mouth open slightly as if trying to form words that the air refused to carry. The smell came next, a smell of wet earth and old rust, and something that made Erin think of the dead flowers left on gravestones. She pressed the emergency button, but nothing happened. No sound, no light, just the soft hum of the train as it moved through the tunnel, and the reflection of the man in the brown coat, who was now standing in the aisle 3 steps away from her, the eyes locked on hers, the mouth moving without sound. She turned to run, but the carriage seemed longer now. The doors at the end, farther than they should have been, the seats seemed to stretch on forever, the lights above flickering in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. She stumbled over a bag on the floor, catching herself on a pole. As she turned to look back, the man was there, closer now, reaching out a hand that was pale and thin, the fingers long and stiff, as if they had forgotten how to bend. Erin screamed, but the sound was small, lost in the humming of the train, lost in the cold air that wrapped around her like the breath of the dead. Train slowed down, and for a moment hope flickered in her chest as the doors opened. But the station was not her station. It was not any station she had seen before. The platform was cracked and dark, the lights broke in the air, heavy with the smell of mold and dust. She could see no signs, no maps, nothing but darkness stretching in both directions. She turned back to the carriage, but the man was there now, standing in the doorway, blocking her path, his eyes on hers, his hand reaching for her. Erin stepped back onto the platform, clutching her books, her breath clouding in the cold air. Doors closed behind her, and the train began to move. again leaving her standing alone on the platform in the dark. The sound of the train fading into the tunnel, leaving her with silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing on her chest. She turned around slowly, scanning the platform looking for a way out, but there were no stairs, no signs, no way up, only darkness, and the soft sound of dripping water somewhere far away. She began to walk slowly, the sound of her footsteps echoing around her, the cold air biting at her skin. She heard footsteps behind her, slow, careful footsteps that matched hers. Step for step she stopped, and the footsteps stopped. She started walking again, faster now, and the footsteps followed, matching her pace. She could feel eyes on her, the same gray, empty eyes that had watched her in the reflection. She broke into a run, clutching her books to her chest, the air tearing at her lungs as she ran down the platform. But the footsteps followed, always just behind her, always matching her speed. She saw a door at the far end of the platform, a heavy metal door, slightly open, light leaking through the crack. She ran toward it, hoping, praying that it would lead to stairs, to the street, to anywhere but here. But as she reached the door, she felt a hand on her shoulder, cold and heavy, pulling her back. She turned and saw him, the man in the brown coat, standing behind her, his eyes locked on hers, his mouth moving as if trying to speak. The smell of rust and decay washing over her as she struggled to pull away. The door opened fully, and she stumbled through, falling onto cold concrete, the light above flickering as she scrambled to her feet. She was in a maintenance tunnel, narrow and dark, the walls wet with leaking water, the air heavy and cold. She could hear the footsteps behind her, slow and steady. As the man stepped through the door, his eyes never leaving hers, his hand reaching out again, Aaron backed away down the tunnel, the light above flickering and dying, leaving her in darkness. She could hear him breathing now, slow, deep breaths that filled the tunnel with the sound of death. She turned and ran, the darkness swallowing her as she moved deeper into the tunnel, the sound of his footsteps following her. Always close, always there. She felt the cold air wrap around her, felt the fear claw at her mind as she ran blindly through the dark, hoping for a door, a light, a way out. But the tunnel went on and on, the darkness endless, the cold unending. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment the silence was worse than the sound. She stopped too, her breath loud in her ears, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She turned slowly, and there he was standing in the darkness, his eyes glowing softly in the dim light that leaked from cracks above the brown coat hanging from his shoulders like a shadow, his hand reaching out one last time. Aaron stepped back, but there was nowhere to go, the tunnel behind her a dead end, the darkness pressing close. The man stepped closer, his hand touching her cheek, cold as ice, his eyes looking into hers, seeing everything, knowing everything. And in that moment, Aaron saw them all, the faces of those who had disappeared on the subway, their eyes wide, their mouths open and silent, screams trapped in the darkness, waiting, watching. And she knew then that she would never leave that place. She would never see the sun again, never feel the warmth of day, never hear her mother's voice calling her home. The last thing she felt was the cold breath of the man in the brown coat as he whispered her name, Aaron, Aaron, and the darkness took her. You think you are alone when you run to catch the last train, but someone else is running too. Chris had worked these tunnels for 9 years, fixing broken lights, repairing old wires, clearing trash from the tracks. He knew every sound, every crack, every whisper of the rails. He knew the stories, 2 stories of the man in the brown coat, stories of the screams that echoed in the tunnels, stories of people who vanished between stations, never to be seen again. Chris never believed them until the night he heard footsteps in a tunnel that was supposed to be empty. It was past midnight, and the station above was closed. The last train had already gone. The tunnels were supposed to be quiet, but that night they were not. Chris was checking a faulty signal near the south tunnel, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, the smell of wet stone and iron thick in the air, the hum of the city above barely reaching this far down. He heard it then, footsteps slow and steady coming from the darkness behind him. He turned quickly, shining his light down the tunnel, but it was empty. The track stretched into darkness, the only sound the dripping of water from the ceiling. Chris called out, his voice echoing off the walls, but no one answered. He told himself it was the echo of his own steps, or maybe a rat, but the footsteps came again, closer now, matching his step for step. He moved faster, the footsteps moved faster too, always just behind him, always close enough for him to feel the cold breath of someone. He could not see the air around him, felt heavier, colder, as if the darkness itself was pressing against his skin. He reached the signal box, opening it with shaking hands, trying to focus on the wires, on the lights, on the job. But the footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound. He turned, slowly shining his light around the tunnel. The beam catching on old graffiti scratched into the walls, messages half erased. "Help me. I am still here. They took me." And in that moment, the tunnel felt like a graveyard filled with voices that could no longer scream. Chris heard a whisper close to his ear, his name, Chris. "Chris, come with us." He spun around, but there was no one there, just the darkness and the feeling of cold fingers brushing against the back of his neck. He dropped his tools, backing away from the signal box, the light shaking. In his hand he saw it, then a door in the tunnel wall, slightly open, a light flickering inside. He had never seen that door before, and he knew every door in these tunnels, every passage, every dead end. But this door was new. The whisper came again. "Chris. Chris, help us, please." And he felt his feet move toward the door, even as his mind screamed to run, to leave, to never look back. But the whisper was soft and sad, and it sounded like a child crying for help. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air colder here, the darkness thicker, the light above flickering weakly, showing a narrow passage lined with old bricks, wet with leaking water, the smell of rust and decay stronger. Now he moved down the passage slowly, the light shaking in his hand, the floor slick under his boots. He saw something on the ground, a small silver locket, open with a photo inside, a girl and her mother smiling in a world that was far away from this darkness. He picked it up, feeling the cold metal in his hand. The whisper coming again, softer. "Now, Chris, help us, please, help you." Moved deeper into the passage, the light above flickering and dying, leaving him in darkness. The only light, the beam from his flashlight. Cutting through the black, he saw more things. On the ground, a cracked phone with a dead screen, a scarf stained with something dark, a small teddy bear missing an eye, each item a piece of someone who had been here before, someone who had not left. The whisper grew louder, more voices now overlapping. "Chris, Chris, help us, Chris." He felt the air move around him, felt the cold press against his skin as he turned, the light catching on something ahead. A shadow moving in the darkness, tall, thin, wearing a brown coat, the eyes gray and empty, the mouth moving without sound. The man in the brown coat was standing there watching him, the hand reaching out slowly. Chris stepped back, but the passage behind him was gone, replaced by darkness that swallowed the light. The whisper was all around him. Now the voices of the lost calling to him, begging him to help them, to see them, to remember them. The man in the brown coat stepped closer, his eyes locked on Chris's, mouth moving, as if trying to speak, but no sound came out, only the whispers of the others filling the air. Chris felt something cold wrap around his wrist, pulling him forward, the hand of the man in the brown coat, cold and strong, the eyes looking into his, seeing everything, knowing everything. And in that moment Chris saw them. All the faces of those who had disappeared in the tunnels, their eyes wide, their mouths open, in silent screams, trapped in the darkness. Waiting, watching, hoping that someone would see them, someone would remember them. The man in the brown coat pulled Chris closer, the whisper in his ear. "Now, Chris, you can help us. You can free us." Chris felt tears on his face, cold and sharp, as the darkness pressed closer, the light from his flashlight flickering, the faces of the lost appearing in the beam, one by one, each face a memory, each face a plea for help. The little girl with the teddy bear, the girl with the locket, the man in the suit, the mother with the shopping bag, all of them watching him, all of them waiting. Chris felt the cold seep into his skin, felt the darkness crawl into his bones, as the hand of the man in the brown coat gripped his wrist tighter, pulling him into the darkness, pulling him into the place where the screams never stopped and the footsteps never faded. He tried to pull away, tried to scream, but the whisper was in his mind now, in his blood, in his breath. "Chris, help us. Chris, stay with us, Chris." The Last thing Chris saw was the light from his flashlight falling to the ground, the beam rolling across the faces of the lost before the darkness swallowed it, and the last thing he heard was his own name whispered over and over. Chris, 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 as the darkness took him. Some trains keep moving underground long after the schedule ends, filled with the people who never made it home, the ghost train they call it, the one that circles the tunnels at 3:33 in the morning. Its lights dim, its windows dark, its carriages filled with the lost and the taken, the ones who stepped onto the last train and never stepped off. Chris opened his eyes and found himself inside that train, the carriage cold, the seats lined with silent passengers. Their eyes open, staring into the dark, their bodies swaying gently with the motion of the train. But there was no breathing, no blinking, no heartbeat, only the endless sound of the train moving through the tunnels that were too dark, too deep, too far from the world. Above he tried to stand, but the cold was heavy on his body, pressing him down, keeping him. In the seat across from him sat the little girl with the teddy bear, her eyes empty, her mouth open, as if she was still trying to call for her mother. Next to her was the man in the suit, his tie crooked, his eyes staring at the floor, his hands gripping the briefcase that no longer mattered. Further down was the girl with the locket, her hair falling around her face, her eyes wide with the last fear she had felt before the darkness took her. They were all there, all the faces Chris had seen in the tunnels, all the souls that had whispered to him, calling him, begging him to see them, to remember them. The lights inside the carriage flickered, casting shadows that danced across the pale faces. The man in the brown coat stood at the far end of the carriage, his eyes like fog, his skin like paper, his mouth moving without sound as he watched the passengers watched. Chris watched the tunnel outside where there was no light, no station, no end. The train rattled as it moved, the sound echoing in the cold air. Chris tried to call out, tried to scream, but his voice was gone, trapped in the cold that filled his lungs, that wrapped around his heart, that turned his breath into frost on the window. Beside him the train slowed down, and for a moment hope flickered inside Chris like the last spark of a dying fire. The doors opened, but there was no platform, no station, only darkness stretching out like a mouth waiting to swallow everything. The man in the brown coat turned slowly, his eyes locking on Chris, his hand lifting as he pointed to the door, his mouth moving in a silent command. And one by one, the passengers stood up, their movements slow, stiff, their eyes empty as they walked toward the open doors, stepping into the darkness without hesitation, without fear, without hope. Chris felt his body move, rising from the seat, his legs heavy as if the darkness was inside his bones, controlling him, pulling him toward the door, the cold air from the tunnel touching his skin like the breath of something ancient, something endless. He tried to stop, tried to fight, but the whispers came back soft and cold. Chris, Chris, come with us, come home with us, and he felt tears on his face, freezing. As they fell, the darkness outside was waiting, the tunnel alive with shadows that moved and shifted, with shapes that had no names. Reached the door and looked back at the carriage, now almost empty. The girl with the locket turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his, and in that moment he saw the last piece of her that remembered the world above, the sunlight, the warmth, the laughter, and it broke him. Because he knew there was no going back, no escape. The train had no destination, no end. It would move forever in the dark, carrying its passengers deeper and deeper into the tunnels, until there was nothing left of them but the memory of their fear. The man in the brown coat stepped closer, his eyes like fog, his mouth opening, and for the first time Chris heard his voice. It was like the sound of wind in a graveyard, soft, cold, empty. Next stop, you. And the man smiled, a smile that had no warmth, no kindness, only the promise of endless darkness. The passengers disappeared into the tunnel, one by one, and Chris felt his foot move forward, stepping off the train onto the invisible ground of the tunnel, the darkness wrapping around him like a shroud, pulling him away from the light of the carriage. Could see them now, all the faces of the lost walking with him through the dark, their eyes empty, their mouths open in silent screams that would never end. They moved together, deeper into the tunnel, the whispers growing louder, filling the space with the sound of names and memories. that were fading with every step. The train behind them began to move again, the lights inside flickering as it rolled away into the darkness, searching for the next station, the next passengers, the next souls to claim. Chris turned his head one last time, seeing the light of the train fade into the black, seeing the man in the brown coat watching him from the last carriage, the eyes like fog, the mouth moving in a whisper that only Chris could hear. And he knew then that the train would keep moving, the passengers would keep waiting, the darkness would keep growing, and the tunnels would always be hungry, always waiting for the next breath, the next heartbeat, the next soul. And the next time you see empty carriages rattling past in the dark, do not look inside, because if you do, they will know you are watching, and they will be waiting for you on the next ride. The end.